Goeiemôre dames en here en baie dankie vir almal wat vanoggend uitgekom het. Ons vra om verskoning dat ons so klein bietjie later begin het, maar dankie vir julle geduld. Net om die verloop van vanoggend se verrigtinge net vinnig deur te hardloop. First of all, we will be asking Dr. Dirk Herman, the Chief Executive of Solidarity, to give us an introduction and a background on this campaign. And then after him, Johan Creer, Deputy Chief Executive of Solidarity, will discuss the lawful aspects of the campaign. And then lastly, Kali Kriel, CEO of AfriForum, will explain the international strategy. Later this morning, he indicated that he will be a little bit late. Mark Fish will also be joining us, and he is one of several sports stars who indicated that they will also be supporting this campaign in the weeks to come. So, over to Dr. Herman.
Thank you very much. Baie dankie ook, baie welkom. En ook vir die mense wat direk op die livestream luister. Dit is ons ook lekker om met julle te gesels. Judge Mbalula, also known as the Minister of Sport, on 25th of April sentenced the 4 main governing bodies for sport in the country, namely those for athletics, netball, rugby and cricket. Their privilege to host sporting tournaments has been revoked because certain racial quotas have not been reached. Ironically, he is acting in terms of a charter and an agreement drafted by the sector itself, with his sword over their heads. In other words, this sector prepared its own charge sheet, built its own gallows, and Mbalula is washing his hands in innocence. Sport in South Africa is regulated by the National Sport and Recreation Act. This act prohibits the minister from interfering when it comes to the selection of sport teams. This prohibition is also in line with the dictates of international sporting codes. However, the Act also makes provision for the formulation of policy and the issuing of regulations. So a national sport and recreation plan was developed in accordance with the Act, and emanating from this plan, a transformation charter was developed for South African sport. This charter was accepted by the entire sports sector as well as by Cabinet. The charter states that its focus is on changing the demographic profile of sport, and although government may not impose transformation, they are using the sword of recognition, funding and political pressure to force sporting bodies into a transformation squeeze. The charter states that it is not government policy to promote the racial composition of sports teams or to prescribe to sports federations how to select their teams. No, it is a noble process that comes from within the sector itself. And should sport bodies not stick to their own undertakings, then the public executioner, and that's the minister, will step in to protect the sector's noble objectives. No government interference, just self-regulation, according to the minister. To help the sector reach its own noble objectives, the minister then appointed a transformation commission known as the Eminent Persons Group to monitor progress made in terms of the charter. The commission in turn came up with a transformation barometer by which to measure progress. The barometer then has given rise to transformation agreements the federations committed themselves to. Those transformation agreements have set quotas for each form of sport. For example, a quota of 60% black players at all levels of the game, all the way down to under 16 level, has been set in the strategic plan for rugby. Should the quotas not be reached, punitive measures may be imposed. Hier is die ongelooflike. Hierdie strafmaatreëls, hulle was so oortuig dat hulle hierdie onrealistiese teikens kan haal, dat die bedryf of die sektor gesê het, dat luister, die minister mag ons maar straf, indien ons dit nie bereik nie. So among other things, The punitive measures include that the minister can withdraw funding and that the sports body's privilege to host international tournaments be suspended. Thus, rugby, for instance, subjects itself voluntarily to penalties and then, ironically, as executed by the minister. Based on the weight of the Act, political pressure, threats, and regulations, the minister forced sport federations to set voluntary transformation targets by which he would measure and punish them should they not comply with their own self-regulation. The question is then whether such action is in the first place lawful and whether it could be regarded as non-interference. Well, the answer is obvious. It is unlawful, and of course, it amounts to interference. Only a fool would consider this to be voluntary regulation. The courts have already ruled that the relationship between rugby unions and players is that of an employer and an employee. The Employment Equity Act is the only act that regulates affirmative action between employers and employees. And this act prohibits quotas. And in terms of the act, employers can use a job's positions, inherent requirements, the availability of skills, or in any other reasonable grounds as reason why the national demographics cannot be set as a target. By setting quotas, the minister and rugby unions are acting clearly unlawful in terms of this act. Rugby unions could justify non-compliance by resorting to the inherent requirements of the position and of course the international codes that have to be abided by. Nou, die belangrike is hier dat die staat tree op totaal buitekant die wetgewing wat spesifiek transformasie reguleer. Dit is asof hulle dit totaal ignoreer. En daarom sal ons eerste aanval wees op 'n baie eenvoudige ding. En dit is jy moet voldoen aan die Suid-Afrikaanse wetgewing wat quotas verbied. Nie net die wetgewing nie, maar ook die afgelope tyd was regspraak baie duidelik gewees dat dit eenvoudig nie aanvaarbaar is nie. Jy kan nie as minister sê dat luister, ek is eintlik 'n bietjie verhewe bo die stukke wetgewing nie. Ek sal self my eie regulasies uitvaardig. Ek sal self my eie strawwe uitdeel buite die riglyne van die wet. Johan Creer sal heel wat meer daaroor sê. But I also said international codes. International sporting codes, such as the Olympic Charter and the rules and regulations of international rugby, stipulate that governments may not interfere in sport, that the best teams must be selected, and that there may not be discrimination based on race. The South African government violates those international regulations at more than one level, but Kali Kriel will focus on that. Local sports federations have built their own gallows because they did not have the democratic confidence to challenge the minister when they should have and could have done so. En hierdie is 'n verskriklike belangrike deel. Dat wat hier gebeur het is dat sportfederasies het nie die demokratiese selfvertroue gehad om op te staan teen die minister nie. They are volunteering to be hanged so as not to be killed. They swung the balance of power in the minister's favor, enabling him to enforce his ideology of race. Sports bodies are here to act in the interest of their sport and to balance out abuse of power. However, they are acting like loyal subjects, thereby stimulating abuse of power. Die kort en die lank is dus dat die sportfederasies neem nie die demokratiese reg op en om die waarheid te sê, die plig op wat hulle het nie. Hulle plig is baie eenvoudig en dis om magsbalans te veroorsaak. Maar wat hulle doen is, hulle tree op soos loyale onderdane en nie soos instellings wat moet optree vir hulle sport en sodoende balans teweegbring nie. En dit is eenvoudig hoekom hierdie ding so skeef trek, omdat die sportfederasies nie doen wat hulle moet doen nie. Hulle maak asof hulle in diens eintlik amptenare is van die minister. Hulle het geen begrip van hoe 'n demokratiese, die balans in 'n demokratiese bestel veronderstel is om te werk. Now, Solidariteit and AfriForum decided to launch a comprehensive strategy to improve the balance of power in sport. It will include local court action and complaints to be lodged with the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, and numerous international sporting bodies. We are, however, also calling on local sporting bodies to stand up and be counted for their sport and not to be bullied by politics. In our international bid, we will go with this message. Sportsmen should be first to insist that merit and merit alone be the criterion for selecting teams for representative sport. Indeed, non-discrimination is such an essential part of true sportsmanship that many clubs and international bodies have expressed provisions to this effect. For example, the first fundamental principle of the Olympic Charter states, no discrimination is allowed against any country or person on grounds of race, religion, or political affiliation. And this exact quote is not the quote of Solidarity and AfriForum. This is the stance of the ANC, prepared for the United Nations in 1971. And we will use the exact same stance of the ANC in 1971 when we go to the United Nations in August this year. Ironically, we stand with this one with the ANC. This Solidarity and AfriForum campaign will also include a massive public awareness program, a national referendum to test South Africans' feelings about this campaign, and that referendum will be launched today. This referendum will be supported by billboards, radio and TV ads, and a big social media campaign. South Africans will be surprised by the feeling of black and white South Africans about merit and sport. I conclude with the results of a survey conducted by the South African Institute of Race Relations with the title Reasons for Hope. On the question, should South African sport teams be selected only on merit and ability and not by racial quotas? 77% of all South Africans said yes. 74.2% of black South Africans say yes, merit alone. 87% of colours, 94.9% of Asians, and 84.3% of whites. Thus, it's not Solidarity and AfriForum that rejects the minister's racial quotas idea. It's clearly South Africa. Thank you.
Just wait for that presentation to warm up. Should come up now. Hopefully you'll be able to see. at the risk of repeating some of the issues that Dirk has raised, I'll try to skip insofar as insofar as there is a repetitive nature. There we go. Okay. I hope you can all see there. So a lot of what Dirk has said, I've tried to sort of unpack here in a PowerPoint presentation, just to give you a rundown of our way of thinking. It's quite a lot of information to digest. So hopefully this will assist in eventually taking us to where the legal challenge lies and what we seek to do as AfriForum and Solidarity. So the structure of the presentation is really a lot of the items that Dirk has already touched on. International charters on sport, the Constitution, obviously the overarching legislative provision there, or the highest law in the country. Then we touch a bit on the Employment Equity Act and PAPUDA. Then we look at the National Sports and Recreation Act, and then we sort of funnel down towards the Transformation Charters and the Memorandums of Understanding, eventually going into the legal challenge. So with regards to the international charters of sport, I think Dirk has already mentioned that a number of international bodies prohibits discrimination in sports, and also prohibit governments from interfering in team selections. The Olympic Charter and the World Rugby bylaws have been mentioned as apt examples, and of course if there is such an interference or discrimination in sport, it can result in South Africa being suspended and or expelled from international sporting bodies, exactly what happened to South Africa during the apartheid regime. So Dirk has touched on what the ANC has said along with the anti-apartheid movement during 1971 to the United Nations Unit on Apartheid. It's quite ironic that we have to go back to the United Nations during August this year to go and argue the very same thing. So basically what was argued there is that the moral position is absolutely clear. Human beings should not be willing partners in perpetuating a system of racial discrimination. Sportsmen have a special duty in this regard, in that they should be first to insist that merit, and merit alone, be the criterion for selecting teams for representative sport. Indeed, non-discrimination is such an essential part of true sportsmanship that many clubs and international bodies have expressed provisions to this effect. So it might as well have been said today, although it was said in 1971 by the very same ANC who is now imposing these very strict measures by way of Mr. Malula. So let us look at the Constitution. Obviously everything stands in the, or must be viewed through the prism of the Constitution. Section 9(2) is the Equality Clause. We know that to promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. So there is an empowering provision that legislative provisions can be promulgated in order to give effect to in order to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. But in the very same breath, there's also the general clause that the state may not unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone or one or more of the grounds, and we have the grounds there, including race, of course. So you have, in the very same breath, you have the general anti-discrimination clause in the Constitution. So what's happening here must be viewed through the prism of those two, at least those two clauses of the Constitution. So then we go down to the Employment Equity Act, and PAPUDA, and Dirk has alluded to it, that it's strike law already that the relationship between professional sportsmen and women and unions or federations on national provincial level has been confirmed by the courts as an employment relationship. That's absolute of paramount importance when we have this discussion on what is happening and what Minister Malula is doing here. So in the employment context, because there is that relationship, the Employment Equity Act deals with that whole relationship. So the Employment Equity Act is the act that should be viewed as the empowering act, but also the one that regulates the whole relationship when it comes to the employment relationship between sportsmen and women and their federations. So that the act, of course, deals with unfair discrimination and affirmative action and so forth. So there's a second act that deals with unfair discrimination and affirmative action, but that deals with those two issues outside of the employment context. So if you want to approach the Equality Court on the grounds of Sportkwotas, you have to use this mechanism outside of an employment context relationship. So what government does is, and it's quite important, is that government seeks to circumvent the EEA. You'll get Minister Malula saying that this act is not applicable to us, where it clearly is applicable. It's the applicable law in South Africa. So if there is any way to deal with employment relationship, the setting of numerical bills, etc., this is the act that should be used. But quite obviously, it's not in the interest of Minister Malula to use this act, because this act is in itself an interfering mechanism, and it's a mechanism which is in itself contrary to the powers of the minister. So he finds himself actually in a catch-22 situation, that if he wants to take these sort of measures that he now does through the charters and the memorandums of understanding, he's actually invoking he's actually doing what he shouldn't do, he's interfering. But if he does do it under the Employment Equity Act, he's interfering as well. So it's quite clear that affirmative action isn't something that should belong in sport. So that's the predicament that he has. So he tries to circumvent that, and he says that if there's any act that gives us guidance, it's Sportkwotas. But he can't do that, and that's one of the main issues that we'll take forward in our legal challenge, and I'll come to that again. The other act is, Dirk has alluded that to the National Sports and Recreation Act. He may determine general policy, and he may, among others, institute policy relating to necessary affirmative action controls, and so forth. So he has certain powers, but he may not interfere in matters relating to the selection of teams, the administration of sport, appointment, termination of service, etc. And that is exactly where the gist of the issue lies, is that while he has these powers, he's going too far. So when he exercises these powers, the benchmark or the yardstick for his actions must always be: is he interfering in the selection of teams? Is he contravening this specific stipulations of the Act in what he does? And we're clearly saying that he is, with what he's doing now, and we'll come to that a little more. So he has powers, but he's curbed. His powers are curbed by this self-regulating, or his powers are curbed by the internal qualification imposed by that Act, in that he can't interfere in team selection, etc. So basically what Dirk has said, from this Act, the National Sport and Recreation Plan was created, and that in turn gave birth to the Transformation Charter for South African sport, that was signed by SASCOC on the one hand, on behalf of all the sporting bodies in South Africa, and the Ministry on the other side. And in the end, that led to the Memorandum of Understandings with at least 4 of what they call the Big Five, and those are the big federations that come into play now: rugby, netball, cricket, athletics, and of course football. But football has already been deemed by the Eminent Persons Group as transformed. So let's take stock again, just before we go further. Is that we have the international charters that prohibit government from interfering in sports. So we have an Employment Equity Act that applies because there's an employer-employee relationship. So if anything, that act must be used. But if that act is utilized, it's interference in itself. So it would be a circuitous argument in that sense. So because the only escape valve that he has is to say that we're applying affirmative action, which in itself is not discriminatory, because it is permitted by law that unfair discrimination or discrimination can take place if it forms part of rational affirmative action measures. But the very act of raising that as a defence will be to say that yes, I'm using the Employment Equity Act, and that in itself is interference which isn't warranted. So I've already alluded to the catch-22 situation. So in the end, because there's no reliance on the Act, which gives you that escape valve, the Minister now finds himself in difficult waters. He's trying to steer through these waters by transformation charters and these memorandums of understanding, trying to wash his hands in innocence, saying, well, these are self-regulatory measures, where he clearly is the driving power behind that, along with the eminent persons group. Dirk has already made that point. So if the defence that can be raised in court, namely that of affirmative action, cannot be raised in this instance because that would be interference, which is prohibited, then the Minister and what he does, and these federations and this whole system, I'll come to it a bit more, is now open to challenge in terms of the Constitution and the Employment Equity Act. Simply because if you don't raise affirmative action as a defence, you're open to a challenge that you're now unfairly discriminating on those prohibited grounds that are stated in the Constitution and which is stated in Section 6.2, and that's really the whole front or the whole angle of our attack. And in our estimation, they're all wide open for a big attack because of what I've just said. So I'll come to the exact legal issues that we raise a bit later on, just to make that point. Dirk has alluded to the Transformation Charter. I won't delve into that, but the point is that from the Transformation Charter, there have been 3 reports from the eminent persons group, the Transformation. You can just jump a bit. So that eminent persons group is primary task with providing the Minister with policy advice on the status of transformation, etc. Since the appointment of that group, they've released 3 sport transformation status reports called the Sport Transformation Barometer. Dirk has alluded to that. The first was a pilot study in order to establish a baseline study on the 5 biggest codes in the country, and this allowed the EPG to set recommended targets over a medium term period to be met by the 5 sport federations. So it's important to say that from this charter, this group was tasked to monitor and advise and in the end set targets. And these targets, the word target is something which is by itself inflexible, a goal, but a quota is something which is inflexible. I think that's quite obvious. But although the word targets or goals is used, it's quite obvious a quota. And the punitive nature of, or the punitive measures that are taken if those, or already been taken if those quotas aren't met, is by itself proof that it is a quota. So then there was a second report for the other codes, and where baselines were sought to be established for the other codes, not the big 5, and also in terms of this second report, certain racial targets were set that should be reached before the release of the next report. And this is basically where we find ourselves now. The third of these reports were released on 25 April of this year, and subsequent to that the Minister imposed the punitive measures. So there were these targets set, or these quotas set, they weren't met, and of course one of the punitive measures agreed between the parties kicked in. So we're still in the process of getting all the MOUs from all the big five, because we will be joining at least the four, except football, as respondents in this case, but they're not readily available. But I think what is, just to use the wording to explain or to prove that we're speaking about quotas, is that from the Eminent Persons Group, the status report 2014-2015, this is not the latest one. The latest one is not readily available. We've tried to get it, but this one, the previous one, already states that this is now the Eminent Persons Group giving a status report, and they say actual transformation performance in each dimension is determined at regular intervals and using monitoring trends, recommending interventions and providing feedback to all stakeholders. Now this is the point that I want to emphasize. Based on observations made, targets or where necessary quotas are set to ensure continued progress towards the achievement of specific goals and objectives. This is the wording of that group themselves. So where necessary quotas, and it's quite clear that that's deemed as quite necessary because it's mainly quotas. Dirk has already alluded to SARU as an example of these quotas. So I won't go into that again, but there is a strict expectation of a quota that should be met, and the objectives of this plan by SARU is to be achieved by the year 2019 and include all levels of rugby, from amateur competitions up to Springboks management, coaching, referees, executive board, etc. So if one takes a look at this charter and this whole structure of these reports, it's amazing to see the level of interference at all levels. It's almost incomprehensible. It's so synthetic that or such an interference that it's absolutely unwarranted. But the extent is quite big. But now, okay, that plan says 2019 you must reach those. That's for SARU now, those targets. But now they've been given a rap on the knuckles by Mr. Malula to force them to reach that. So it's again that the punitive measure that's now being used to force them to reach those targets. So let me now come to the legal challenge. So it's I hope it makes sense. It's quite new ground that we're covering in South Africa. I think this is will potentially be one of the biggest cases in this sphere, because sometimes this hasn't been done. But what we will seek as Solidarity and Alpha Forum is we will approach the court to seek an order declaring the relevant parts of the following documents as unlawful, insofar as it imposes the obligation to have racial quotas in the composition of teams. So basically, we're not asking for the whole of those documents that you see there to be declared unlawful, but only those parts that seek to set racial quotas or impose the obligation to set racial quotas. And that is the National Sports and Recreation Plan. That's the Transformation Charter for South African Sports. The memorandums of understanding signed by SARU, Cricket SA, Netball SA, and Athletics South Africa. So that is the first step. We want to declare those parts that impose the obligation to have racial quotas as unlawful on the basis that it falls foul of Section 6 of the Employment Equity Act and Section 9 of the Constitution. It's basically unfair discrimination on the basis of race, and in the absence of absence of a legal defence, which can only be raised in terms of the Employment Equity Act. We think there's a big attack to be mounted there. And then secondly, I think this is also something that hasn't been done before, but we'll seek an order declaring that all sports federations, including but not limited to unions or clubs, or in the end even school level, are exempted from complying with Chapter 3 of the Employment Equity Act insofar as it relates to the setting of numerical goals. So Chapter 3 deals with affirmative action of the Act. So we're saying that that those federations should be exempted from complying with that Act in setting numerical goals. Any alternative, we ask that that the court declare that these federations are entitled to invoke the provisions of Section 62B of the Employment Equity Act as a defence for the failure to set numerical goals for representative teams. Let me just pause there. That that defence simply says that it's not unfair discrimination. So if you don't set those goals, so if you don't do what Minister Malula now wants you to do, if you don't impose those quotas in itself is prohibited, but if you don't reach those goals, you can raise a defence to say that I'm excluding a person or I'm preferring another person on the basis of the inherent requirements of the job. So it's quite obvious that the inherent requirement of the job is that merit, and merit alone, in the words of the ANC, is the inherent requirement of the job. So therefore I'm saying I'm raising this as a defence for not reaching goals or setting goals in terms of the Employment Equity Act. So I hope it's clear, it's a bit abstract, but furthermore we'll seek an order to review the decision of the Minister Malula to revoke those privileges of one of the respondents, basically to revoke the privilege of those four respondents that we're talking about. It's SARU, Netball SA, Cricket SA and Athletics SA. We'll seek that to review that decision by Minister Malula to revoke that privilege to host or bid for any major or mega international tournament in South Africa, and we'll base, or we have that right in terms of both the Employment Equity Act and the Promotion of the Administrative Justice Act. So we want to have that reviewed and set aside, and that's basically the gist of the legal challenge. So just to recap, it's basically to say that the sporting federations, we can just go back again, hope you following, to declare those parts of those documents imposing racial quotas as unlawful. It's seeking an order that sporting federations are exempted from setting numerical goals in terms of the Employment Equity Act, or alternatively declaring that they have the right to raise a defence to say that the inherent requirements of the job, of the sporting job, is that the best person for the job should be chosen, and quotas is therefore not allowed. And then thirdly, reviewing the decision of the Minister, as I've said. So those are the domestic routes that we seek to pursue, and then the international route is that that African Solidarity will file a supplementary complaint against the government at the UN's Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So this is really a body that was created in terms of a convention that Solidarity has ratified, and therefore South Africa must adhere to the provisions of that convention. We're saying that what's happening here is contrary to the provisions of that convention. So Solidarity has already filed a complaint there that's due to be heard in August, but we'll find both Afriforum and ourselves will now file a supplementary complaint, also dealing specifically with what's happening now here with this sporting quotas, and we will also present that on the 9th and the 10th of August this year at the hearing of South Africa's report in Geneva, where the government must come to defend their position, and we will, of course, attack what we deem as unfair discrimination. So we'll seek a recommendation from CERD in this regard, and we'll simultaneously also at the International Labour Organization in Geneva in August file a complaint against government. So that's a different agency. File a complaint against government for contravening the Convention 111 that South Africa has also ratified. And then there's also a host of other international routes that we will take. But Kali Kriel of the firm will take us a bit through that. So thank you.
Thank you, Johan. I'll be very quick. What I'm about to say is very simple and easy to understand, so you don't need to concentrate too much while I'm speaking. The fact is, if you ask the question, why do we now enter the sporting world? And the reason for that is simple. The international or the South African sporting federations have become spineless, and if the minister says jump, they simply ask how high. And I think it's very important now that sport lovers, the civil society, the public as a whole, need to take a stance in the areas where the sporting federations are spineless. We are very happy from Afriforum side that we are now able to cooperate with our sister organization Solidarity, and it's actually a very good fit because if you look at the implications of the quota system, it has an impact on the careers of people, because we know that sport is a professional, is a job for people. They simply don't always just do it in their spare time. There are people that makes it their career. So it's important that we have the experience of Solidarity with regard to court cases that have already made with regard to the workplace. But it's more than just an impact on people's jobs. It infringes on people's dignity. And that's why, as a civil society or civil rights organization, Afriforum feels quite strongly about this. And we believe that this joint campaign between ourselves and Solidarity would be one of the biggest campaigns that have ever come from the broader Solidarity movement. In this campaign, you've heard that we will go to the South African courts, to the UN, to the International Labour Organization, but we'll also then go to specific sporting federations. And the two attacks there, if you look at most of the sporting federations, they have quite specific rules and regulations saying that there should be no political interference into sport, and there should also be not any form of racial discrimination. And in your media packages, I've put a document that states that. I think the most prominent sporting document is the Olympic Charter. If you look at Principle 5, it says any form of discrimination with regard to a country or person on grounds of race, religion, politics, gender, or otherwise is incompatible with belonging to the Olympic movement, which I think is self-explanatory. Rule 210 of the Olympic Charter says to oppose any political or commercial abuse of sport and athletes. And what we are seeing now is that the Minister of Sport is indeed abusing athletes to promote his racial ideology. And then Rule 1615 states clearly, members of the IOC will not accept from government organizations or other parties any mandate or instruction liable to interfere with the freedom of their action. And this is exactly what we are seeing happening in South Africa at the moment with the way the Minister of Sport conducts himself. I'm not going through all these regulations. You've got it in your media package. It says what the World Rugby's bylaw says also prohibiting government interference directly and racial discrimination. The same applies for the IAAF with regard to athletics. The International Cricket Council is also clear in this regard. The International Netball Federation states the same, and of course also FIFA states this. You would have, if we take on these issues, you would, those people that don't want to look at the real issues, that we are infringing on people's rights and that we are in contravention of international federations regulations, would simply say, well, you don't want black people to participate in sport. And the fact is, from AfriForum side, and Solidarity will also confirm that, we believe that all South Africans should have access and opportunities to participate in sport. But how do we get to that point? If I look at my own children, for instance, they were not exposed to sport by some measure the minister took or any sporting federation took. They were exposed by sport through teachers that were willing to give up their time and for the love of sport invest their time in exposing children to opportunities. And you're not going to reach this by an artificial racial quota system. You are going to reach this by making sure that South African schools are functional. So if there's anybody that should be penalized or punitive measures should be taken against them, it should be against the South African government, because we see that 80% of schools, according to the Minister of Basic Education herself, are dysfunctional, where teachers are no more than 3.5 hours in a class per day. So there's not an effective academic program, and there's not even a hint of any sport in those schools. I've seen many pictures of facilities in municipalities that are deteriorating due to maladministration. So the real problem that we have, you're not going to expose children to sport if you have a dysfunctional education system, and the primary obligation of government is to make sure that we have a functional school system, and that is where we should focus. What happens now with the quota system, it's simply artificial. You can look at schools in Pretoria, the rugby union, local rugby union here, does not make a big effort to promote the sport in Atteridgeville and Mamelodi. You have dysfunctional schools in many of those areas, unfortunately. And now, because of this artificial system, they go and simply recruit so-called black players in the Western Cape and take them from their parents' house to serve a certain racial ideology. So we believe that if we are successful to challenge the artificial quota system, it would be in the interest of everybody in the country, because then there will be the government will be forced to focus on the real issue, and that is to make sure that our schools are functional and that there are ample facilities and that people are able to participate. Then just the last remark with regard to the impact of the quota system. Of course, it has an impact on Africans with a lighter complexion, such as myself, because we know that there are players that weren't chosen to go to the Rugby World Cup simply because of race. We know in the Cricket World Cup, the unfortunate incident where a player was not chosen because there was an instruction from South Africa that there had to be a certain racial quota. But it does not only have a negative impact on white players, also on so-called black players it has a negative impact. We've spoken to numerous players in this regard, and for them it's actually an insult to be portrayed as a quota system, as a quota player, sorry about that. And if you go look specifically now at the Springbok team being selected now, I think South Africans would all like to say this, we are glad about this team, but there's always this question mark now being raised. And especially if you read in the media that the team that was selected was also given to the Minister of Sport for approval. That creates a question mark over the players that have been chosen now. which I believe is to their detriment as well. And that is why we are going ahead full blast to make sure that we challenge this. You've heard our plans, what we are doing. We also call on the public to support us. The campaign we call the No to Quotas campaign, or Nee vir Quotas. And we've also, as Dirk mentioned, launched a referendum where people can participate on a website, Nee vir Quotas website. But also we're going to do SMS votes as well. So I won't ask the media to do so, but the other people that are here, if you are so inspired by what we are doing and that you want to vote against quotas, we also have an SMS number where you can vote. It's 45343, where you can simply SMS the word no. But of course you are also welcome to be part of the small political elite that want to abuse sport, and then you can also vote yes. But we are sure that also with regard to the research that mentioned that 77% of South Africans are against the quota system, we believe that we will show the international sporting bodies as well as the courts that we have broad public support for our campaign.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And afterwards, you are more than welcome for any interviews with any one of the people sitting in front. Okay, questions?
Good morning, Barry Bateman, Eyewitness News. Just on this envisaged plan, have you engaged as yet any of the administrators in the particular sporting codes? Are they aware of what you're going to be doing? It's one thing to fight on somebody's behalf, but do you have their buy-in? Do they agree with what you're going to be doing?
I can speak, I know Solidarity will say what they've done. They've, with regard writing to the Minister, but from AfriForum side, we were part with Solidarity already 2 years ago. We started to engage the Minister of Sport on this issue, and we had a meeting with him, also gave him a memorandum on how we think sport, the alternative for development should be rather than a quota system. Unfortunately, our efforts were ignored. We also wrote, for instance, to SA Rugby with regard to the quota system, and they indicated that they were going to go ahead with the quota system. So it seems like the sporting federations, as Dirk also mentioned, are just jumping if the Minister says they should. And that's why I believe it's appropriate that we now take action to make sure that we get rid of what we believe is an unjust quota system.
I think it's important just to say that we don't act on behalf of, we don't fight on behalf of the sporting federations, we act on behalf of the South African public. And in this specific case, we say that we experience that the sporting federations actually do not stand up for the South African public and for sport. They stand up for the Minister, and they go into unlawful agreements with the Minister. So we stand up as for justice and for the public, and we don't fight on behalf of the federation. So that's important. But Johan just also said about our legal correspondence.
Yes, we corresponded with Minister Mbalula, basically requesting him to retract that. To retract the revocation of the privileges that's in question, and also to give us an undertaking that the government will comply with its national and international obligations regarding sport, specifically what they should do in terms of international charters and the Sports and Recreation Act. But yes, we haven't heard anything from them in that regard.
I think what's important on this is that's not a question of that we plan to start with legal action. That's of course the first steps of a legal process. So we already started that with the legal process.
Just on the federation side, as Dirk mentioned, they will be respondents. So we're corresponding with them to get the specific memorandums of understanding that they have concluded with the Minister, to also challenge and also to demand from them that they also, repudiate those agreements on the basis that it's unlawful. So that's the step to.
Carla van Enies. Kali, eerst vir jou, net in Afrikaans ook, hoekom doen julle hierdie, of hoekom veg julle namens, of ek dink ek sê nie namens nie, maar die sportliggame, net daar wat jy gesê het van, want hulle staan nie op teen die minister nie, en ek gaan sommer Dirkse vraag ook vra, hoekom is dit belangrik om so ver as moontlik te gaan met hierdie, en om dit te kry?
Ek dink dit is baie duidelik vir ons dat die Suid-Afrikaanse sportliggame het ruggraatloos geraak, en as die minister van sport spring, dan vra hulle hoe hoog. En ek dink die Suid-Afrikaanse sportpubliek, mense wat lief is vir die sport, het nou 'n plig saam met burgerlike instellings om standpunt in te neem. En dit is wat Afriforum en Solidariteit nou gaan doen met regsaksies, met internasionale optrede, want ons glo dit is die regte ding om te doen. Jong kinders se sportdrome word vernietig weens die ANC se rasgedrewe ideologie, en ook sportmense se loopbane wat professionele sport doen word vernietig, en ons glo dit is reg om daarteen op te tree en te sê moenie mense benadeel nie. As ons wil hê die sport moet toeganklik wees vir almal, en dit is wat Afriforum en Solidariteit wil hê, fokus dan om die skoolstelsel reg te kry, want 80% van die skole is wanfunksioneel, en daardie taak lê by die regering. So as iemand gestraf moet word, is dit die regering vir hulle gebrek aan effektiwiteit om die skoolstelsel reg te kry, en nou straf hulle ongelukkig jong sportlui en kinders deur 'n rasse-ideologie om Suid-Afrikaanse sport af te dwing.
Vir 'n demokrasie om te werk, moet daar magsbalans wees. Wat ons sien in die sportomgewing, daar is op die oomblik nie magsbalans nie. Ons sit met 'n politieke boelie in die vorm van 'n minister wat eenvoudig regulasies afdwing, wat in die eerste plek onregmatig is, en in die tweede plek sport benadeel, en in die derde plek Suid-Afrika in die gevaar plaas om nie meer internasionaal deel te neem nie. Die Solidariteit en Afriforum veldtog is dus ook 'n veldtog teen politieke boelies wat onregmatige rasse-idees op die Suid-Afrikaanse samelewing probeer afdwing. Indien ons dit toelaat, dan gebeur dit dat ons buite die reg 'n nuwe werklikheid begin skep wat nie belyn is met die Suid-Afrikaanse demokrasie en grondwet nie, en ons sê daarom dat jy moet opstaan, Suid-Afrikaners in 'n groot massa, en eenvoudig sê nee vir rassekwotas, dit is nie regmatig nie.
Just one follow-up. Cully, you did address it to some degree. We know how the criticism and the response is going to be. They're going to say, typical Afriforum, racists trying to, maintain their preserve of privilege within the sporting code. How are you going to address that public perception that is certainly going to be driven by some quarters in South Africa, whether it be from government or certain other interest groups in this? How are you going to tackle that perception of your challenge as being racist?
Well, I don't think that perception is real, in the sense that if you look at the research by the Institute of Race Relations, says that 77% of South Africans say that merit should be the criteria. These accusations you are speaking about is driven by a small group of political elite that have an interest in racial profiling, an interest that racial ideology is enforced on our society, and we expect that from them. We don't believe that any sober argument would make them publicly declare or change their minds publicly, but we know that these accusations are politically driven, and it's like water from a duck. I think if we want to act in the interest of the country, in the interest of our children, then we should not allow, as Dirk mentioned, political bullies to use false accusations of racism to try and silence us. We will not be silenced because we have international regulations behind us. We believe that we have the South African law behind us. So we're going to take on this fight. and they are actually just wasting their breath by accusing us of racism. They know it's not true, we know it's not true, and we believe we are doing the right thing.
Maybe if I just can latch on to what Kalia said there, that because of this knee-jerk reaction that we're racist, and that's the bottom line, we are forced, as Kali said, to approach all these bodies to independently adjudicate whether we are racist or not. If the legal challenge succeeds, then obviously it's unlawful, but because, and if the international challenges succeed, then that's further proof. But because there's no open debate on the issue, a sensible, reasonable debate on the issue, but simply a knee-jerk reaction, we're forced to go that route. And therefore, we know that, at least for now, that knee-jerk reaction will always be there, but we don't pay it any heed.
Now, South Africa is a constitutional state. South Africa is not, in the first place, a transformational state. The minister acts as if the constitution must act within the parameters of transformation. It's the other way around. Transformation must act within the parameters of the constitution. And if a civil group comes and say that, listen, you act outside the parameters of the constitution of South Africa, you can't then, your reaction be, you are the racist. The irony here is that we are saying that you are acting outside the boundaries of the South African democracy. And thus they are actually acting outside the parameters of the Constitution. And what we want to do is to bring them back within the orderly way of transformation within the parameters of the Constitution.
Any other questions?
Net nog een vir Johan. Miskien as jy net vir ons gou in Herman, jy net nog baie dankie. As jy miskien net vir ons in Afrikaans kan sê, wat is die jy hoef nou nie soveel in detail te gaan nie, maar net kortliks, wat is stap 1 wat julle nou gaan doen en wat is die beste wat julle nou bevat?
Goed, ons gaan nou die sportfederasies finaal aanmaan, om spesifiek hulle memorandums van verstandhouding met die minister in die hande te kry en ook vir hulle te sê om daardie ooreenkomste te repudieer op die basis daarvan dat dit onregmatig is. Ons gaan nou voortgaan dat indien dit nie terugtrek nie, om gedeeltes van die nasionale die sporttransformasie handves, spesifieke memorandums van verstandhouding, alle dokumente wat voortspruitend is uit die minister se dryf om kwotas daar te stel, gaan ons vra dat die spesifieke gedeeltes daar wat hierdie kwotas magtig as onregmatig verklaar word, soos net die spesifieke gedeelte, nie die hele dokument nie. Tweedens gaan ons sê dat in die lig van wat hier gebeur, moet 'n werkgewer, met ander woorde 'n sportfederasie of 'n klub, 'n liggaam met iemand wat in sy diens staan, die reg hê om te kan sê dat ek myself wil vrystel van hoofstuk 3 van die wet op gelyke en dienslewering, met ander woorde spesifiek regstellende aksie, omdat die inherente vereistes van hierdie werk, sport, eenvoudig jou noodsaak om te sê die beste persoon die pos moet kry of die posisie moet kry, met ander woorde meriete moet die boot invoer, en dan derdens gaan ons vra dat die besluit van minister Mbalula om die terugtrekking van hierdie federasies om internasionale sportgeleenthede aan te gebied, dat dit eenvoudig dat daai besluit om dit tersyde te stel hersien word in terme van die wet op geregtelike hersiening of die wet op administratiewe geregtigheid eerder, maar ook in terme van die wet op gelyke en dienslewering.
Miskien net nog 'n vraag, en die laaste een, gaan jy dit in die arbeidshof?
Ja, die arbeidshof het ook jurisdiksie in terme van die wet op gelyke en dienslewering, maar ook 'n hersieningsfunksie uit te oefen. En dan is daar natuurlik internasionale
Enige ander vrae? Gelukkig. Okay. Thank you so much for everybody who came out today. as I mentioned before, I am going to check if Markfish is here. If you have any questions for him and he is not here, I can give you his number should you need a quote. But I believe you have sufficient information for this. Thank you so much again for everybody who came out.